What would you do if the fate of your child depended on a single sentence in a courtroom? Imagine standing before a judge, your hands trembling, not begging for yourself, but begging for the life of someone you love more than your own. Friends, that is exactly what happened on one unforgettable morning in Judge Frank Caprio's courtroom. A father stepped forward, his face etched with exhaustion, his voice raw with desperation. And what he said next didn't just move the judge, it stopped the entire room cold. He wasn't asking for mercy because he was guilty. He wasn't trying to escape responsibility. He was pleading for something far greater, the survival of his child. His words were not rehearsed, not polished, not even easy to hear. They came out like a wound torn open, sharp, painful, undeniable. "Your Honor," he said, his voice shaking, "please, don't punish me. If you do, my child will suffer." Those words silenced everything. The rustling of papers, the coughs from the back row, even the faint hum of the air conditioning seemed to fade. Every pair of eyes in that room turned toward him. What could possibly drive a man to such a plea? What story lay behind those trembling words? Judge Caprio sat back, stunned. He had heard countless excuses, a lifetime of reasons why people couldn't pay fines, but never had he heard something like this. This wasn't about pride. It wasn't about money. It was about love, raw, desperate, unfiltered love. And in that moment the entire courtroom felt it too. Some leaned forward, holding their breath. Others stared at the father, tears welling in their eyes, as if they could feel the weight pressing down on his soul. Even those who had come prepared to argue their own cases forgot about their tickets, their fines, their worries. All they could see was one father, standing in the center of the room, fighting for the most important thing in his world. But here's the question that will keep you watching, friends. What would Judge Caprio do with a plea like that? Would he dismiss it as another excuse, or would he answer it in a way that shocked everyone who witnessed it? Judge Frank Caprio's courtroom isn't like most courtrooms you imagine. It doesn't feel cold or intimidating. It isn't filled with stiff silence and sharp glares. Instead, it carries something unusual, a sense of humanity. People walk in expecting fear, but many walk out having felt kindness. On this particular morning, the benches were lined with men and women holding small slips of paper. Parking tickets, speeding violations, minor citations. For some, it was a small inconvenience. For others, the fine meant the difference between paying a bill or skipping a meal. Every person carried not just a ticket, but a story. The cases moved quickly. A young delivery driver explained how he double-parked while carrying food to a customer. A mother nervously admitted to running a red light when she was rushing to get her child to the hospital. A college student laughed awkwardly as she tried to explain why she couldn't afford to pay her ticket on time. Judge Caprio listened to each, his voice steady, his demeanor warm. Sometimes he smiled, sometimes he asked questions, sometimes he leaned in close as though the person before him was the only one in the room. He had a gift for making people feel seen. He wasn't just reading cases, he was listening to lives. But in between the gentle laughter and the quick dismissals of fines, there was an undercurrent of tension. Every person who stepped up to the bench carried a small piece of fear. Would the judge be merciful? Would he understand? And then, the atmosphere shifted. The bailiff called the next name. A man rose slowly from the back row. His shoulders were bent forward, weighed down by more than just the citation he carried. His clothes were plain, his hair slightly disheveled, but it was his eyes that told the real story, tired, sunken, as if sleep had long ago abandoned him. As he walked toward the bench, the room seemed to grow quieter. The laughter that had softened earlier cases vanished. Even before he spoke, something about his presence commanded silence. This wasn't just another man with another ticket. He stood before Judge Caprio, clutching the piece of paper in his hands as though it were heavier than stone. The judge glanced at the citation, a minor violation, nothing unusual. But when he looked back up at the man, he saw something different. There was no hint of arrogance, no rehearsed excuse. Instead, there was fear. And beneath the fear, there was something even stronger, desperation. The judge tilted his head, his voice calm as always. "Good morning, sir. How are you today?" The man hesitated, as if the question itself was too heavy to answer. His mouth opened, but no words came out. His lips quivered, and his hands tightened around the paper until it wrinkled. The room grew still. Everyone knew something unusual was about to happen. Friends, this is where the ordinary rhythm of Judge Caprio's courtroom ended. Because in a matter of seconds, this father was about to reveal a truth so painful, so raw, that it would stop the courtroom cold. And no one, not the people in the benches, not even Judge Caprio himself, could have predicted what his next words would be. The father stood at the bench, his hands gripping the citation as though letting go of it would mean letting go of the last shred of control he had left. His shoulders slumped forward, his back curved not from age, but from the invisible weight he carried. Every step he had taken to reach this moment seemed to echo inside him. At first glance it looked like an ordinary case. A simple unpaid fine. A late response to a summons. Something that should have taken less than 2 minutes to process before the judge moved on to the next name on the docket. But the longer he stood there, the clearer it became that this was no ordinary case. Judge Caprio looked at him carefully. "Sir, it says here you have an outstanding fine. Do you understand why you're here today?" The man nodded. His lips parted, but the words caught in his throat. His voice was hoarse, as though silence had become a habit in his life, as though he had grown used to keeping his struggles hidden. Finally, with a tremor that carried through the quiet courtroom, he spoke. "Yes, Your Honor. I know why I'm here. But it's not as simple as it looks." The courtroom leaned in, though no one moved. It was as if the room itself had taken a breath, waiting for what would follow. He explained, haltingly at first, that the ticket wasn't the real problem. "It's not that I don't care about the fine," he said, his eyes dropping to the floor. "Is that I can't. Not without taking from somewhere else. And the only place left to take from is my child." Judge Caprio's expression softened. He had heard countless stories of hardship before, but there was something different about this man's tone. It wasn't defensive. It wasn't angry. It was quiet, filled with the kind of resignation that only comes from a long fight already endured. The man's voice grew steadier as he continued. He spoke of his daily routine, waking up before dawn to take 2 buses across the city, working long hours at a job that paid little more than survival. He described coming home not to rest but to another shift, cooking, cleaning, caring for a child who depended on him for everything. His clothes were plain, his hair graying at the edges, but it was his eyes that betrayed the truth. They carried years of sleepless nights, of skipped meals, of silent sacrifices made when no one else was watching. At first, some in the courtroom assumed it was the familiar story of a struggling parent, one they had perhaps heard before. But then the man's voice cracked, and he revealed something no one expected. "My daughter is sick," he whispered, his hand tightening around the citation. "Every dollar I have goes to her medicine. Some weeks I don't eat properly so she can. Some weeks I walk instead of paying for the bus just to save enough. I've fallen behind not because I don't care about the law, but because she comes first. Always." A murmur passed through the courtroom but quickly died down. The air thickened with the weight of his words. Suddenly, the citation in his hand seemed meaningless compared to the story spilling from his lips. He went on, explaining that when the fine arrived, he stared at it for days, not knowing what to do. "I thought of paying it," he admitted, "but then I thought of the prescription waiting at the pharmacy. What choice did I have? Do I pay the court, or do I keep my daughter alive?" His voice broke on the last word. For the first time he lifted his eyes to meet the judge's. They were wet, shimmering with the raw honesty of a man who had run out of places to hide his pain. And in that moment, every person watching realized something. This wasn't about a fine anymore. This was about survival. The courtroom remained frozen, caught between disbelief and sorrow. This man hadn't come to argue or make excuses. He had come because he had no choice. And in confessing his truth, he had laid bare a question larger than the law itself. Friends, put yourself in his shoes. What would you have done? Would you have paid the fine and let your child go without medicine? Or would you have risked the law to save the one person who means everything? The father's story had only just begun, but already it had shaken the room. And as his words hung in the air, Judge Caprio leaned forward, realizing that the plea he was about to hear might change not just the outcome of the case, but the way everyone in that courtroom understood justice. The judge's gaze remained steady, but his eyes softened as the father continued. What had begun as an ordinary traffic violation was quickly unfolding into something no one expected. This man wasn't fighting against the law, he was fighting against life itself, every single day. He took a deep breath, his voice trembling. "Your Honor, every dollar I make has only one destination. It doesn't go to me. It doesn't go to anything extra. It goes to keeping my daughter alive." The words carried a weight that silenced even the shuffling in the benches. People leaned forward unconsciously, as if the gravity of his confession pulled them closer. He explained how he worked long shifts at a factory, the kind of job that left his hands calloused and his back aching, but it still wasn't enough. When other parents clocked out and went home to rest, he left one job only to begin another, hauling boxes at a warehouse at night, or cleaning offices after hours. His days blurred into nights and his nights into dawns. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "I go 2 days on coffee and water. Because if I buy food for me, that's less for her medicine. Less for the rent. Less for keeping the lights on so she's not afraid." Gasps rippled through the courtroom, but the man pressed on, his voice gathering strength. He described walking miles instead of taking the bus, sometimes arriving to work drenched in sweat or soaked from rain. He would rather feel the sting of blisters on his feet than the ache of knowing he had stolen from his daughter's health. He talked about nights when the cupboards were bare, when he made a meal from scraps just to put something in her stomach, while he quietly told her he wasn't hungry. "She thinks I eat after she goes to bed," he admitted, his voice breaking. "But the truth is, I don't. I can't. Because I have to make sure she has enough." The benches behind him were still now, no longer the restless crowd waiting their turn. Men and women sat frozen, some with their hands over their mouths, others blinking away tears. The courtroom wasn't listening to a defendant anymore, they were listening to a father stripped bare by love and sacrifice. Friends, ask yourself this: how far would you go for your child? Would you give up meals, comfort, even dignity? Would you walk through storms just to save a few dollars, knowing every cent could be the difference between life and death? The man's voice cracked again as he spoke about the fear that haunted him every day. "I look at her when she sleeps," he said softly, "and I wonder if I'm doing enough. I wonder if one mistake, one fine, one bill I can't pay, will be the thing that takes her away from me." Those words settled into the air heavier than any legal argument ever could. It wasn't rebellion against the law that brought him here. It was the crushing reality of being a parent cornered by circumstances no father should have to endure. Judge Caprio leaned back in his chair, visibly moved. His lips tightened, and for a moment, his eyes glistened with the kind of recognition only a parent could know. The father lowered his gaze, ashamed. "I know the law has to be the law," he whispered. "But I'm begging you, understand why I failed. Understand that my child's survival means more than any ticket ever could." A chill moved through the room. The ordinary rhythm of citations and fines had been shattered by one man's truth. What remained was a question that no gavel could easily answer. Should the law punish a father for sacrificing himself in order to save his child? The weight of that question pressed against everyone in the courtroom. And as the silence grew heavier, one truth became clear. This father wasn't just explaining why he couldn't pay. He was exposing the unbearable cost of love, measured not in dollars, but in sleepless nights, skipped meals, and a heart that refused to quit. The father's words had already painted a picture of sacrifice that no fine could measure. But what came next pierced the room like a blade, cutting through every heart in its path. He stood there, trembling, his eyes glistening, his hands twisting the wrinkled citation until it nearly tore in two. Finally, he lifted his head and locked eyes with Judge Caprio. His voice, though cracked and unsteady, carried a force that silenced the courtroom completely. "Your Honor," he whispered, "please, don't punish me. If you do, my child will suffer." Those 7 words crashed into the room like a thunderclap. The murmurs died instantly. The rustling of papers stopped. It was as if time itself had frozen. Every person in that courtroom felt it, the weight of a plea that went far beyond legal arguments, beyond excuses, beyond defense. It was a plea born from love so raw that it left no space for pride. He wasn't asking for himself. He wasn't trying to escape responsibility. He was standing in the open, vulnerable, admitting that the smallest punishment would not land on him alone. It would land on his child. The judge's lips parted, but no words came out. For once, the man known for always knowing what to say sat silent, his own breath caught in the enormity of the moment. The father's voice shook as he continued. "I can live with hunger. I can walk for miles. I can sleep on the floor if I have to. But she can't. She needs her medicine. She needs her father standing, not broken. Please, I'm not asking for mercy for me. I'm asking for mercy for her." A tear slid down his cheek, but he didn't wipe it away. He let it fall because this wasn't about appearances anymore. It was about truth laid bare for the world to see. Friends, imagine hearing those words. What would you do if the punishment you handed down meant a child suffering? What would justice even look like then? The benches behind him were no longer filled with strangers. They had become witnesses to something far larger than a court case. A woman in the back pressed her hand against her chest, her eyes shimmering. A man clenched his jaw tightly, looking away as though trying to hold himself together. Even the bailiff, usually stoic, shifted uncomfortably, his throat tightening. The plea lingered in the air, heavier than the gavel resting on the bench. It was a reminder that sometimes, Laws collide with life in ways that defy simple answers. The father's voice softened now, almost breaking into a whisper. She's the only thing I have left, Your Honor. If I lose her, there's nothing left of me. So whatever you do, please, don't let her be the one who pays the price. The words hung there, fragile yet unshakable. They didn't just speak of desperation. They spoke of devotion, of the unyielding love that drives a parent to the edge of humiliation if it means saving their child. Judge Caprio lowered his gaze, his jaw tight, his hands clasped together on the bench. He had presided over thousands of cases, seen every kind of story walk into his courtroom, but this was different. The weight of being a father himself pressed against him now, forcing him to see not just a man before him, but a mirror of the lengths any parent would go for their child. And still the room waited. The plea had been spoken, the truth had been laid bare, and now all that remained was the question: what would justice choose? Cold law, or compassionate mercy? Judge Frank Caprio sat motionless, his gavel untouched, his hands folded on the bench. The father's words still lingered in the air like a weight pressing down on every soul in the room. For once, the judge, known for his steady composure and quick wit, seemed unable to speak. His chest rose and fell slowly, as though he too was carrying the burden of that plea. Finally he leaned forward. His eyes, usually sharp and focused, now glistened with something unexpected, tears that had begun to gather despite his effort to hold them back. His voice, when it came, was quieter than usual, trembling at the edges. "Sir," he said softly, "your words, they cut right into my heart. I've been sitting here for many years and I've heard countless stories, countless excuses. But what you've shared today, this isn't an excuse. This is love. This is sacrifice." The father bowed his head, unable to meet the judge's gaze. Caprio's voice broke slightly as he continued. "You remind me of my own father. He came to this country with nothing but hope in his pocket. He worked every day, morning until night, so that we could have a chance. I remember him going without food sometimes so we could eat. I remember his shoes worn through, but he never complained. He just kept going because his family came first." The courtroom shifted. No one expected the judge, the man in the robe, seated above all, to bear his own scars in front of strangers. Yet here he was, speaking not as a judge, but as a son who had once seen a man just like this father fight for survival. "I'll never forget one winter," Caprio said, his voice shaking now. "Our home was so cold and we had so little. My father wrapped us in blankets while he stayed up, pacing the floor to keep warm. He suffered so we could rest. That's the memory that comes to me now, listening to you. Because I see the same devotion in your eyes. The same fire." The father slowly lifted his head, his eyes red but shining. For a moment, it was as if two worlds met. One man who had already lived through sacrifice and another who was living it now. Caprio exhaled deeply, his voice thick with emotion. "Sir, I want you to hear me clearly. You are not a failure. You are not negligent. You are a father doing what fathers are called to do, to protect their children at all costs. And I honor that. I respect that more than I can ever put into words." The benches behind them were still, but the silence was no longer heavy with suspense. It was reverent, like the quiet in a church when something sacred has just been spoken. People glanced at one another, eyes wet, as if sharing the realization that they were witnessing a moment of rare truth. The judge paused again, pressing his lips together as he gathered himself. "I know the law must be respected. I know my role here is to uphold it. But I would be lying if I said I wasn't deeply moved. Because when I look at you, I don't just see a case file. I see my own father. I see myself as a boy, standing in the shadow of a man who gave everything for his children. And I cannot ignore that." His voice cracked on the last word, and for the first time, those watching saw something extraordinary, a judge allowing his humanity to break through his robe. Friends, think about that for a moment. How often do we see authority figures stripped of pretense, willing to show that beneath the role lies a beating heart? That day, Judge Caprio reminded everyone that true justice isn't cold. Feels. It listens. Remembers. The father stood still, tears running freely down his cheeks now. And though no decision had yet been announced, something had already shifted. This was no longer just a courtroom. It was a place where love and mercy had collided. The gavel remained silent. But in that silence, everyone knew, the decision that was coming would not be ordinary. It would be one to remember. The courtroom held its breath. The father's plea had stripped the room bare, and Judge Caprio's trembling words had opened wounds of his own past. But now came the moment everyone had been waiting for, the ruling. The silence was almost unbearable, every pair of eyes fixed on the man seated high above the bench, waiting to see whether law or mercy would prevail. Judge Caprio straightened slowly, his hands folded on the desk in front of him. For a long moment he simply looked at the father, not as a defendant but as a man. Then he reached for the citation on the desk, studied it briefly, and placed it gently to the side. His voice, when it came, carried no hesitation. "Sir," he said, "I could fine you today. I could order payment. The law gives me that authority. But if I do that, I know exactly who will pay the price. And it won't be you. It will be your child." A murmur swept through the courtroom. The judge's words landed with the weight of undeniable truth. Caprio leaned forward, his voice firm but compassionate. "And I cannot, in good conscience, allow that to happen. The law was created to serve people, not to destroy them. And in this case, true justice is not measured in dollars. It is measured in mercy." The father blinked, his lips parting as though he hadn't heard correctly. His hands loosened their desperate grip on the crumpled paper. "Your fines," Caprio continued, "are cancelled. Completely. They will not stand against you. Case dismissed." Gasps filled the room. For a split second, there was stunned silence, as if no one could believe what they had just heard. Then, quietly, a wave of relief swept through the benches, heads nodding, tears being wiped, whispers of disbelief turning into murmurs of admiration. But the judge wasn't finished. He looked directly into the father's eyes, his own steady and kind. "More than that, I'm going to connect you with resources here in the city. There are people who can help, people who will walk beside you so you don't have to carry this burden alone. You've proven your devotion. Now let others help carry the weight." The father shook his head slowly, overwhelmed as tears rolled freely down his face. "I don't know how to thank you." Caprio raised a hand, stopping him. "Don't thank me. Take care of your child. That's the most important law you'll ever have to follow." The words settled over the courtroom like a benediction. They weren't just a dismissal of charges. They were a commandment, spoken with the authority of a judge and the tenderness of a father. For a moment, the room was silent again, but it was no longer heavy silence. It was the hush of reverence, the quiet that comes when people realize they have just witnessed something rare, something sacred. Then, unexpectedly, a soft ripple of applause began at the back. It spread quickly, echoing through the benches until the entire courtroom joined in. Some clapped with tears on their cheeks, others with quiet smiles of relief. It was a sound of approval, of gratitude, of recognition that justice had just been defined not by punishment but by compassion. The father lowered his head, his body shaking as though the burden he had carried for years had finally been lifted. He turned to walk back toward the benches, but his step was lighter now. For the first time, he wasn't walking under the crushing weight of fear. He was walking with hope. And as he left the bench, one truth remained in the minds of everyone who had witnessed it. This was more than a ruling. This was a moment when justice chose humanity, and one father's plea became a lesson none would ever forget. Friends, how often do we see punishment handed down without ever knowing the pain behind it? How often do we look at a fine, a mistake, a rule broken, and fail to see the human story that led there? One father's plea showed us that behind every case there is a life. And sometimes, compassion has the power to rewrite destiny. That day, Judge Frank Caprio didn't just cancel a fine. He chose to listen. He chose to see the man, not the mistake. He reminded us all that mercy is not weakness, it is strength. And in showing mercy, he didn't just change the outcome of a court case. He changed a family's future. Friends, think about what this means for us. What if we chose to pause before judging? What if we asked one more question before assuming we knew the whole story? What if we, too, made room for compassion? I want to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever experienced a moment when someone showed you mercy at your lowest point? Or have you ever seen someone's life change because someone chose kindness over punishment? Your story might inspire someone else to believe again. And if this story touched your heart, share it with a friend who needs hope today. You never know, that one share might be the spark that changes their tomorrow. As for what happened when another parent stepped forward in Judge Caprio's courtroom with a plea that stunned everyone, that, my friends, is a story for the next episode. And trust me, you won't want to miss it.